Welcome to the Wounds of the Faithful podcast, brought to you by DSW Ministries. Your host is singer, songwriter, speaker, and domestic violence advocate Diana Winkler. She is passionate about helping survivors in the church heal from domestic violence and abuse and trauma. This podcast is not a substitute for professional counseling or qualified medical help. Now, here is Diana.
Everybody, welcome back. We're going to do part 2 of my conversation with Marcy Pusey, and we had a great time last week talking about all kinds of stuff. We got to know her a little bit. She loves to travel. She lived in Germany for a while. She's acted in some musicals and movies, and she is a counselor and a trauma and resilience practitioner. She's a speaker and a best-selling author of books for adults and children. And she's a great storyteller. Very funny gal. We talked about how her writing won her and her family tickets to the circus. Is that exciting or what? And we left off with talking about her marriage that has ended and some of the abuses that went on there, both from her husband and from the church community. And so now this week, we're going to talk about her experience with fostering and adopting and the challenges there. Her parenting skills didn't work with the foster to adopt children that she has. So she's going to share with what did work and the shifts that she had to make. I think that is very valuable. How do you deal with trauma that the children bring into the family? How do you help them to heal while you're healing from your own trauma? And she's going to go into the really traumatic event that happened in her home where her mother-in-law was murdered right in the house. And so I don't want to delay it any further here. So here's part 2 of a conversation. Here's Marcy. Now, did you want to talk more about your experience with fostering and adopting? I mean, what were some of the struggles that you had?
Well, if we continue to go back to my childhood and the messages that I carried, I brought those to parenting too. I brought those to my marriage. I brought those to parenting. I brought those to my relationship with God. And so the way that showed up in my parenting was these kids need a home and I have a home. They need beds and I have beds. And I knew the need because I worked in that industry. So I knew that families were separated all the time and that kids were often sent out of the city, out of the county, because there was no space within the one they came from. The change was tremendous. Or they were placed with like families who were in it for money, who didn't even speak the language. You know, we've got some like local farming communities that for a while, I don't know still, but they were placing kids in those places because they could get food and shelter, but they couldn't understand a thing they said and there was no like cultural connection. So I'm thinking like, well, I can come in and be a hero here, right? I probably didn't use those words, but I thought like,
dun, 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 dun.
Yeah, for sure. I can at least get like 1 or 2 of those kids and spare them whatever the other options are. And so we ended up fostering 7 kids at the same time that we birthed 2. So,
wow.
And that was all in 20 months. So it was really fast. We had a 13-year-old with a baby. We had a 15-year-old. We had siblings. Like we had a whole gamut of kids in the experience. But part of what my experience was, again, like as a woman in our culture, just overall, I find that we judge moms quite a bit for the behavior of their children. Mm-hmm. And so these kids came to me with traumatic backgrounds and beginnings, attachment disorders, all of this like stuff their brain is trying to figure out and understand. And they'll often target the mother figure because of that original mother wound that they were separated from. So here I am, the mother in the role, and they're not behaving the way that I raised them to behave, right? They're unpredictable and they're kind of charming in the public eye, but then scandalous and other words at home. You know, it was like Jekyll and Hyde. It was like raising Jekyll and Hyde as children. And I took responsibility for that. Like, especially as a believer, if God's unconditional love is healing, if he is a healer and his unconditional love doesn't fail, and I'm a conduit of his love, but they're not healing, then it's not his love that's broken, and it's not them, it must be me. So I lived a lot of my parenting years really struggling on a surface level with their behavior and how that was a reflection of me. And so then that made me try harder, pour harder, pray harder, study more, do more, whatever I could, just like I was trying to do with my husband. Now I brought in these kids and I'm doing the same thing with them. If I can help them be happy and healthy and whole, then I am somebody who has worth and value. And I think that's actually way more common. In fact, I was in a group with parents the other day and I heard a mom talking like that, like just the impact of our kids' behavior and the reflection that is on us. And I really had to, but it was God. I literally woke up one day and I heard God say, Marcy, you are a good mom. You're a good mom. And I sat up into that and I was like, I am. I'm a good mom. Perfect moms aren't relatable. So I'm even better than a perfect mom because I'm relatable. I make mistakes. I acknowledge my mistakes. I care. I'm intentional. I try. And it freed me from their behavior. And I just was like, almost had this new delighted energy. Like, you guys, I'm a great mom. If you want to like experience that, I'm here. If you don't, that's so sad, but I get it, you know? And it ended up just being this huge shift for me to allow them to be on their journey. And I didn't have to have the emotional connection to it as far as like my value. I could show up from like a genuine place of love for them, but I could also have really healthy boundaries between me and them. And the boundaries were really about, again, my worth and value. Like, I can let you make these decisions because they don't reflect me and they don't determine whether I have value or worth. And so now I can just love you because none of that anxious energy is attached to it. And that also meant that I could love them in an unconventional way, right? Because again, a lot of our culture is like, well, this is what love looks like. And there's a lot of really specific ways that parents can show love. And there's really specific ways that parents shouldn't show love. You know, an example, I'll just give an example because I know that can be a bit abstract, is kids like mine. I'm trying to decide if this is the example I want. Okay, I'll give this example. When my kids had diagnosable trauma, attachment disorders as a result of their early abuse. And as such, their brains rewired to communicate to them deep down neurologically that anyone who is in the position who should be loving and caring and trustworthy, a caregiver, a mother, a father primarily, right, is actually going to kill them because that very first parent didn't fulfill their obligation from a biological level, right? The body experiences that first person could not keep me safe or chose not to keep me safe or abandoned me because we're not together now. And so the brain rewires and actually flips upside down the understanding of trust and safety and danger and not trust. So in public, they tend to very quickly, superficially attach to strangers. They're often the kids, not every kid who's like this, but they're often the kids who every adult is like, oh my gosh, this is the sweetest, most respectful, cute kid ever. And then you take them home and they're in absolute terror. And some of that is because when you demonstrate traditional forms of love and connection, it triggers their fight or flight. Like, well, the last person who was in this position hurt me, so you probably will too. It's just a brain association, and we can work on that. But I didn't know that. So what I had to learn was how to demonstrate love and connection in a different way. It couldn't be all necessarily physically affectionate or I love you or like emotionally connected in the way I wanted. It had to be slow and mindful. It meant sometimes that I would talk side by side instead of looking at them. You know, so in our culture, like you make eye contact and you look at someone's face and you acknowledge that they're right there in front of you, but that would immediately trigger the fight or flight in my kids. So I had to be creative about how and when can we have conversations that feel connection. But then I also knew to expect that if they began to feel connection, there would be a behavior burst that would follow to sabotage the connection. So in our home, it just looked different. It meant that sometimes I couldn't talk directly to them. I would have to talk about them, like with my husband, and almost like coach or model how the conversation could go if we were actually having it. So other people in the room might be like, that's so rude. You're talking about them in front of them, but it piqued their curiosity. And so it made them pay attention. Whereas when I talked directly to them, it triggered that fight or flight, flooded their brain with all the hormones, and they couldn't hear or listen. So it just was like really upside down. And I had to learn that that was okay, even when other people didn't understand it. Because parents love to give advice and assume that their one way that it's worked is everybody's way. It should work that way. And I had to, like, again, separate myself from my worth or value being tied to how other people felt about how I'm loving these kids. And then at the end of the day, I know that I did my best. There are definitely things that I would do differently, but now they're adults and they have to make decisions for their own healing and recovery. And they're not making the decisions I would want for them or would make for them. And so I continually get to practice, what does it mean to trust them to God and to allow them to have their own journey and not need my fingers all up in it and just be here waiting for them. Kind of like the prodigal father who waited and just waited and watched the horizon. That's a little bit now my role with them, because they've continued to live from their trauma. And I get to hope and pray for them one day to find some healing. But until then, I'm waiting. But it's been an important journey and a powerful journey. And again, like, inducted me into a club that I didn't know existed. And now I get to be a support to families like ours and bring healthy conversation. Like, hey, is this not working for you? Let me tell you why. Let me help you understand the brain. And then we can approach love and connection differently. Or let's like reset expectations. My expectation was, if I unconditionally love you as a conduit of God's love, you're going to heal. Well, that's not actually how it works. Like it doesn't actually work that way. So what can we expect? Well, we can expect that I'm going to do my part and they may not do theirs, and that's okay. Like, they're on their own journey and we still keep doing our part. So that was a long answer to the question of like, what's it like to foster and adopt? But it has been probably one of the most transforming, refining experiences in my life, as far as just my own personal growth as well. So I'm glad that I'm grateful for it, even though it was very hard.
No, I appreciate the long answer, because we talked before the show that I have friends that have done the foster to adoption and they're having a really hard time. And they're just crying and at their wits' end. And it's good to know that they're not alone. I have no training at all in that whatsoever. And so I feel helpless to ease their pain. But
there's 2 books I've written, Reclaiming Hope, I mentioned, and the other is called Parenting Children of Trauma. And in that book, I have some understanding of the brain that I just touched on in our conversation, but also some strategies. Some of those parenting things I just quickly addressed are actual strategies in there that people can try. I actually refused to write that book for a while because I felt like I couldn't step into a home with my magic wand and like fix it, which is what I wanted. I wanted to just give like, here's the equation, and now your family's whole and healthy. It looks like the posters on the wall. And I couldn't do that. And I was sharing that with a new friend. I mean, we were best friends now, but I didn't even know her then. And I remember bringing up something like that. And she said, Marcy, we don't, like, nobody reads your books because they're looking for the magic wand equation. We read your books because you're so good at removing shame from people. And that's what we need. And as soon as she said that, it unlocked in me the ability to write Parenting Children of Trauma. I knew that I could provide a book where shame was lifted. And that has been a go-to book for a lot of families and agencies. I get a lot of feedback from that one. And I think that's why there are strategies. There are things in there. But essentially it's like, hey, there's some brain stuff at work here and it matters. And that's what you're up against. It's not your own worth and value. So a lot of us tie it in. It's not that you're a bad human or a bad parent. It's because you've said yes to this relationship, which is so important and necessary. But the expectations you were set up with were kind of not the right ones, not helpful. So let's reset those. Let's reframe things. Let's redefine love in this context. there was a day, oh, you know what? I was probably writing the book going, God, I don't like this book. I still want the magic wand for people. I think that's what happened. And God kind of gave me this image, because my idea of love was still that you die, because he died for me. And so I'm probably supposed to die for everybody else. That's love. Greater love has no one than this, that a man laid down for his life for his brother, right? And so I just had it in my mind that the only way to love was to die. And I heard this image I got, was like, Marcy, the reason I died for you is because that's what you needed. There was literally no other answer. That's why I died. These kids do not need a dead mother. That is not love for them. And it was like, oh, like what? There's another way to love that doesn't involve me dying? Like, I did not know another way. That was the invisibility piece too, right? Less of me, more of everyone else. And it unlocked me to be able to see the importance of my own existence and the value of my health as a demonstration of love to those kids. And we don't talk about that. I think especially as believers, like, no, you're supposed to die. If you're not pouring out, you're not exhausted, and you're not depleted, then you're not dying enough, right? Like, and so I know it's just this other message we pick up, and I don't believe that. I think there is a time and a place that the word is true. And I think what God showed me was when that's what's needed, but that's not always the way of demonstrating love. And so that's the kind of stuff that I talk about in that book. It's not directly faith based, because I want to help all of the families. I don't want to turn any off, but I do share about how my own faith supported me in the journey. And so that's how that one came about. Parenting children with trauma. Yeah. That's awesome. For anyone who's listening who might be like your friends or connecting. There are those two books. I have one Speranza sweater for that follows a child. It's a picture book. And then I have a free Facebook community called Reclaiming Hope. You are more than your traumatic experiences. And you can join us there too, just as a safe place to process, ask questions. I'll hop on sometimes and do lives and answer questions or share whatever's on my mind. But it's just another way to form community again around hard conversations, but important conversations.
Wow. And you have books that you use art, because that's a healing tool in itself, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that with music. So now I'm also a certified trauma and resilience practitioner. And again, this is all like a deep dive just to understand my own world. Like, just teach me. Like, I want to be a sponge for how do we help then? That's why the first book is Reclaiming Hope. It's not about like, let's just talk about why it's hard. Let's talk about then how we stake our claim, our hope claim in it, and say, no, I will not give up hope here. I just need some help. And I need to be able to talk about the hard things. And so in that journey of learning, how do we talk about the hard things? I've learned a ton about trauma and trauma recovery. And I won't get too geeky about it right now, but I love to talk about it. The brain. Actually, I do have 2 TEDx Talks, and one of them I go into a bit more about the brain. It's You Are More Than Your Traumatic Experiences, and they're on my website. But our brain is wired for our survival naturally, but where it stores traumatic events that have not been processed is in our brainstem, which is like the oldest part of our brain. It's the first to develop when we're born, or being developed in the womb even. And it's responsible for all of our automatic functions. So breathing, sleeping, eating, anything you don't have to think about, but that you do, happens there. But therapy happens with talking. And they talk to our prefrontal cortex, which is very rational and logical. And we need it. We need it, but it's not where the trauma is stored. And so a lot of talk therapy isn't effective because we're not addressing the right part of the brain. The part of the brain that needs addressed is that brainstem, and that's very sensory. This is my prologue into why music and writing and art and all of these things that involve our body and our mind and our emotions, like unscripted especially, are so healing for the traumatized parts of our brain, of the unprocessed trauma that resides in our brainstem. And so we don't even have to fully understand what is stuck there. It's not even always about retelling the story, but telling stories, letting our body tell the story that's trapped inside however it wants. Maybe it's movement, maybe it's dance, and no one even has to see it, but you're just letting your body do what it wants to do. Maybe it's strumming chords or piano keys or whatever it is, and just letting yourself exist uncensored. There's some work you can do prompted. I could say, take the clay and build a little man. But if you take the clay and you just form whatever needs to be formed, there's a healing work that happens regardless. And so that's one of the fun things I've learned about writing, is that all those years of me processing my world that way was a healing act, and I had no idea. Like, my default for survival happened to be very healing. And so the more I told those stories, the more I began to share them publicly, the more I began to get feedback and hear community come alongside me, which is a healing thing for us. Belonging is a healing part of our traumatic experiences. Then I got to move on to the next thing that needed attention. So you said that, if I can throw this back at you a little bit, you said music has been something like that for
Absolutely.
you. What's been your experience as like a singer, a songwriter, a musician? And how have you seen that kind of support you in your own healing?
Well, I'll tell you what, there have been times in my life I didn't understand why I was going through my abuse and trauma, and I was mad at God. I hadn't moved out yet, but I was on the couch, And even if I didn't feel like praying or reading my Bible, there was always music. The music could reach me when nothing else could. God could use a song and reach me and soften my heart and, coax me back into his fold, right? And so when I left my abuser, that was an outlet for me to put my feelings and experience in music to communicate and be there for others going through the same thing. Yeah. You're not alone, right?
That's right. And we're so impacted not only by what we create, but by what we receive. And so I imagine that you can also listen to someone else's song and it can like almost act as your own voice sometimes. Like you resonate so deeply that it feels like it has the same impact, even though you didn't write it.
Exactly.
But it becomes a place of connection. Yeah. This is the power of those sensory activities that we can be part of, that we don't even have to really understand. I didn't know as a 5-year-old or an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old that as I journaled, I was tapping into my brainstem, processing through unprocessed trauma. That's the beauty of it. And I think that's God's design. Our leaning in our design is always towards healing. Our body and our brain is always trying to heal itself. We can prevent that through old habits and patterns and mindsets and all sorts of things, but we're trying to heal. And so I love how his kindness is even demonstrated in that.
Yes.
Right? Like he knew we're in a world full of sin, and yet he gave us a brain and a body and a mind and a spirit that's constantly moving towards health. Regardless of whether we understand it or have the therapist to interpret or explain it or whatever, right? Like we're just doing the things as our body kind of speaks to us.
I want to be respectful of your time because, this is like being in a therapy session right now. This is great stuff, but I wanted, if you're okay with it, you had gone through some trauma on top of all the other trauma you just mentioned, with your mother-in-law being murdered right there in your home.
Yeah.
Are you okay with sharing that story?
Yeah, for sure. So 4 days before my first wedding anniversary, we were set to leave for 10 days. We were going on 2 trips. So the first 10 days were in El Salvador, and then we were going to spend, I think, another 10 days in South America, Paraguay. But when we woke up that morning, my father-in-law woke us up, but then the phone rang and it was an ambulance saying, "Hey, is somebody hurt?" And it ended up that my father-in-law had killed his wife while we were sleeping in the same house. They were down the hall in like a mother-in-law suite. And he had some kind of psychotic blackout that we still don't totally understand. But he came to enough to recognize that she was hurt, to call the police and to wake us up. The part that always gets me is that like somewhere between his part of the house and our part of the house, he came to, because he could have not, right? Like we were just sleeping unsuspecting to what was going on. But by God's grace, he came to and didn't hurt anyone else. Our door was wide open, So it ended up that he killed her. He has no memory of it. And that launched our lives dramatically into at least 3 years of probate court and trying to figure out like in California, if you're insane, do you still inherit? What is insanity? What's innocent by reason of insanity versus guilty by, like, just all these things, right? And so it ended up that he was diagnosed with 2 forms of dementia, one of them stroke induced. So it's possible that some of this happened during a stroke, that he maybe mixed some medication with some alcohol, that he'd been having insomnia for who knows, like this volcano of things seem to have happened. But this was like our newlywed experience. Like, it was already rough because I mentioned abuse. So there are already things happening that I didn't know how to label. And now we're reeling through this. And yeah. So then my son, our firstborn, was born in the same house where my mother-in-law was killed just before we moved out and bought our own house. Because we had to stay in that house for the 3 years while everything was in probate.
Oh.
So we also continued to have to live there. Yeah, but so much. So I did write a book on that too, because I write stories about my experiences to help people. So that one's called While We Slept. Finding Hope and Healing After Homicide. And it's a memoir where I take you through the whole thing, all of it. And there are just so many kind of full circle moments looking back where I'm like, God, you allow the hard things, but you never leave us. Like, his fingerprints are all over everything. And, you know, I may never understand the fullness of why. And I will always grieve that she's gone. She doesn't get to know her grandkids. And I so wish that they could have known her. But at the same time, I know that book has impacted a number of people. And one of my first kind of fan mail messages was from a woman who said, I've been laying in bed for like months, depressed, contemplating taking my own life. I came across your book and I decided, if you can survive that, I can get out of bed today and get dressed and drink some water. And I can do that tomorrow too. And she did. And she's still alive. Like, you know, and I had to overcome some things to publish that book. Not everyone in the family shares my faith or appreciated that I was telling the story, even though they hadn't read it. There was a lot of assumption around why I would tell that story, that surely I meant to harm him. I don't. I have no intent of harming him. And in fact, the only thing people could find if they Googled his name before were the 2 news articles that said he was insane. And so now if you Google him, my book comes up and you get the full story. And it's one of grace and forgiveness and redemption. I mean, I love him. And I'm so sad that he had to live his life like this. Like, it's one thing when you intend to hurt somebody. It's something else when mental illness or whatever happened, like, steps in and you killed your wife and you have no idea. Like, that's, I can't even imagine trying to live his life, you know? So it's hard to, like, the family assumed ill intent of me. And it did cost some relationships that sadly weren't adding anything to me anyway. But again, like, as that people pleaser who is still learning that, like, my value didn't come from other people, I struggled a lot to, like, want everyone to feel happy with me so that I could feel like a good human. And God really confronted me on that and said, Marcy, you're choosing your reputation over my call for you to put this story out there. And so that was like one of those, ouch, but you're right. And so I did eventually hit publish, and it's been really impactful. My TEDx talk is on part of that as well. And it's been an answer to a lot of people who are involved early on, journalists and attorneys, like, how are you guys okay? We deal with hard stories like this all the time, and you guys are okay. Like, how and why are you okay? You know? And it was our faith. Like, for me, like, my faith was the anchor in the midst of that storm. And so because enough people were asking, my book is really an answer to that question. How was I okay? How are we okay in the middle of something so devastating and so surprising? And if that can become a source of hope or inspiration or encouragement for anyone else going through hard things, then, like, it just adds a little more, not to say value, because I've been using that throughout this conversation, but a little bit value to the experience I had, to know that I can also now use it for good and not just leave it as this dark skeleton in the closet that we don't talk about.
Yeah, because you can't really shove the trauma under the carpet and pretend it's not there.
No.
That makes it a lot worse.
And then we miss the miracles that do come. And not every traumatic event, I don't know. I'm not going to make a promise that every traumatic event is followed by a miracle, but I've now had enough experiences in life that every hard thing I've had, with enough distance and hindsight, I can begin to see like these circles, almost like of completion, like this hard thing, but then this beautiful thing, this hard thing, but then this beautiful thing. And I don't want to miss those moments. I could just focus on the hard thing, but then I'd miss the beauty that can come from it. And I don't want to miss those. I want to see the whole thing. I'm going to always grieve. There will always be grief connected to that. But then there's this deep gratitude that's attached also, because I've seen the way that God has continued to use that story for myself, for other family members, for people who don't know us at all, who come across the story. Like, it's so beautiful the way that he uses our stories. Psalm 107:2 says, let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story.
Yeah.
Over and over. And then there's all these little vignettes of hard things. And then it's followed up with like, let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. Like, we're called to share those things, because I know that we're also testifying to the way that he's our anchor. He's our stability. He's enough when we're not. Like, all those pieces come together. So yeah, that's that story.
Yeah. Those moments of beauty are there if we're looking for them, if we allow God to show them to us, if we're closing ourselves off.
Yeah.
Put that wall up and not let anybody in to show you those wonderful times. We miss out on those blessings.
I don't want to interrupt, but in the moment, it becomes cliche, right? Someone's going through something hard and we're like, oh, God will use this for good. That is not the time.
I stopped doing that.
That's not the time. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying this so you now have like more ammunition to go to the next wounded person. No, I just know I can grieve with a person who's grieving. I don't have to say those words. I can let them experience the pain they're in and pray and trust that there's beauty coming. I don't have to make it a promise for them or try to like make their feelings less heavy, because someday maybe, like, no, we sit with each other where we are. We carry the burdens for each other, but I get to have this quiet knowing. And if God prompts me to say whatever, then that's different. But like, for the most part, it's not the time. We just sit
true.
And then believe and hope for them until they're believing and hoping for themselves. And we get to be part of the crowd of witnesses around them when their full circles happen.
Yeah, I had to learn the hard way. Don't Christianese the person you're trying to help. Don't quote Bible verses at them. Yeah, learn that the hard way. I can't imagine trying to heal from, the loss of your mother-in-law that way. There are sometimes no words for that.
No.
But your story is so powerful and what you do. And I'm so appreciative of you coming on the show today. I think the listeners got a lot of value and inspiration. How can they connect with you again? I know you mentioned your stuff before, but if you could say that again one more time.
Yeah, of course. So the best place is my website, which is my first and last name.com, marcypusey.com. My TEDx Talks are there, and then it will direct you to some of the other things I do. So I am a trauma and resilience certified story coach. So I help people tell their story, heal from their story, especially believers who feel called to tell their story and just don't know how or when or where. Maybe it's mindset or logistics. I've got a program and community that supports that. So if you go to marcypusey.com, that's sort of my umbrella site. And then I have a press site, Miramare Ponte Press. I'll give you how to spell that. And that's where some of those things can be found if you're in the process and you want to tell your story and you just need a hand to hold or some guidance or logistics. I feel called to not only shine where God has planted me, but to help others shine where he has planted them. And so whatever is in the way of you shining to the brightest of your ability, I feel called to support you in, especially as it comes to telling your story. Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. Recognizing, because of my therapeutic background, that there is a healing element that's part of it, which always entails a wrestling, right? Mm-hmm. And like revisiting hard things and navigating those emotions. So I bring all of my therapeutic awareness to those conversations and those supports. So marcypusey.com, the press site, and then I'm on Instagram. I hang out there. So that's at Marcy Marie on Instagram. And if you go to marcypusey.com, there's a pop-up that happens. That's a free guide on how to begin thinking about healing through storytelling. So even if you just kind of want to start on like, what does this look like for me? How could I begin to experience healing or offer healing through telling parts of my story? There's a free gift there for that too.
Awesome. I'm going to get that myself, to be honest with you.
Yes.
I'll definitely keep in touch, and
Absolutely.
God bless you.
You too. And thank you again so much for having me. And to all of you who stuck through this and listened, I know it was a little longer, but I just so value that you invited me to this sacred space of your listeners. And I hope that what everyone can walk away with today is, like you said, some encouragement and hope and inspiration, and knowing that you're not alone in any of the hard things that you're going through. And thanks for providing such a space for people to come feel safe and find those connections and know that they're okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening to the Wounds of the Faithful podcast. If this episode has been helpful to you, please hit the subscribe button and tell a friend. You can connect with us at dswministries.org, where you'll find our blog along with our Facebook, Twitter, and our YouTube channel links. Hope to see you next week.